Hi, everyone. So today, a probe finds Governor Cuomo sexually harassed multiple women, violated federal and state law. August 3rd, 2021. Governor Andrew Cuomo violated federal and state laws by sexually harassing multiple women, including current and former state employees, through actions that included touching their intimate body parts without consent. Cuomo allegedly retaliated against some of the victims, creating a toxic and hostile work environment, in the executive chamber officials said. The blockbuster announcement came during a news conference in which State Attorney General Letitia James said an independent probe she commissioned had found that Cuomo engaged in, quote, unwanted groping, kissing, hugging, and making inappropriate comments. The probe involved accusations that Cuomo, 63 years old, sexually harassed several current and former female staffers, most of whom were in their 20s and 30s. Investigations gathered evidence from 11 women, 9 of whom are or were state employees, said former acting Manhattan U.S. Attorney June Kim, one of the 2 outside lawyers hired to conduct the probe. One alleged victim is a state trooper who served in Cuomo's security detail. The trooper told investigators that while she was holding a door open for Cuomo, he passed by and ran his open hand against her stomach. She told us that she felt completely violated. The most serious allegations made public to date came from current aide who said Cuomo reached under her blouse, groped her inside his executive mansion in Albany last year. James hired 2 outside lawyers, former acting Manhattan U.S. Attorney June Kim, an employment discrimination expert, Ann Clark, to conduct a probe, and Cuomo was grilled for about 11 hours in his Manhattan office last month, the New York Times reported on Monday. At several points, the July 17th session, which was recorded on video, got heated when Cuomo confronted Kim over his role in previous investigations of the governor and his allies. So here is the report of the investigation into allegations of sexual harassment by Governor Andrew Cuomo. The executive summary. We, the investigators appointed to conduct an investigation into allegations of sexual harassment by Governor Andrew Cuomo, conclude that Governor engaged in conduct constituting sexual harassment under federal and New York state law. Specifically, we find that the governors sexually harassed a number of current and former New York state employees by, among other things, engaging in unwelcome and non-consensual touching, as well as making numerous offensive comments of a suggestive and sexual nature that created a hostile work environment for the women. Our investigation revealed that the governor's sexually harassing behavior was not limited to members of his own staff, but extended to other state employees, including a state trooper on his protective detail and members of the public. We also conclude that the executive chamber's culture, one filled with fear and intimidation, while at the same time normalizing the governor's frequent flirtations and gender-based comments, contributed to the conditions that allowed the sexual harassment to occur and persist. That culture also influenced the improper and inadequate ways in which the executive chamber has responded to allegations of harassment. The governor's sexually harassing conduct. The governor's sexually harassing conduct established during our investigation and described in greater detail in the factual findings of this report include the following. Executive Assistant Number 1. Since approximately late 2019, the governor engaged in a pattern of inappropriate conduct with an executive assistant, who is a woman. That pattern of conduct included 1. Close and intimate hugs, 2. Kisses on the cheeks, forehead, and at least 1 kiss on the lips, 3. Touching and grabbing the executive assistant number 1's butt during hugs and on one occasion while taking selfies with him, 4. Comments and jokes by the governor about the executive assistant number 1's personal life and relationships, including calling her and another assistant mingle mamas. inquiring multiple times about whether she had cheated or would cheat on her husband, and asking her to help find him a girlfriend. These offensive interactions, among others, culminated in an incident at the executive mansion in November 2020 when the government, during a close hug, executive assistant number 1 reached under her blouse and grabbed her breast. For over 3 months, executive assistant number 1 kept his groping incident to herself and planned to take it to the grave, but found herself emotional in a way that was visible to her colleagues in the executive chamber while watching the governor state at a press conference on March 3rd, 2021, that he had, quote, never touched anyone inappropriately. She then confided in certain of her colleagues, who in turn reported her allegations to senior staff at the executive chamber. Trooper number 1. In early November 2017, the governor briefly met a New York State trooper, a woman, at an event at a Robert F. Kennedy Bridge, also known as the Triborough Bridge. After meeting the trooper, he spoke with a senior member of the Protective Detail, Senior Investigator 1, about seeking to have Trooper number 1 join the Protective Services Unit, the unit of the New York State Police that is in charge of protecting the government and works in close vicinity with the governor. Protecting the governor. Trooper number 1 was then hired in the PSU, despite not meeting the requirements to have at least 3 years of state police service to join the PSU. In an email to Trooper number 1 shortly after the RFK Bridge event, Senior Investigator number 1 noted attaching a vacancy notice within a 2-year service requirement as opposed to 3 years. Haha, they changed the minimum from 3 to 2 just for you. After Trooper number 1 joined the PSU, with Governor sexually harassed her on a number of occasions. Number 1 running his hand across her stomach from her belly button to her right hip while she held the door open for him at an event. 2, running his finger down her back from the top of her neck down her spine in the middle of her back, saying, "Hey you," while she was standing in front of him in an elevator. Kissing her and only her on the cheek in front of another trooper and asking to kiss her on another occasion, which she deflected. 4, making sexually suggestive and gender-based comments, including A, asking her to help him find a girlfriend and describing his criteria for a girlfriend as someone who is or can handle pain. B, asking her why she wanted to get married when marriage means your sex drive goes down. C, asking her why she did not wear a dress. Trooper number 1 found these interactions with the governor not only offensive and uncomfortable, but markedly different from the way the government interacted with members of the PSU who were men, and she conveyed these incidents contemporaneously to colleagues. Several other PSU troopers corroborated Trooper number 1's allegations, including some who had personally witnessed some of the touching and comments, as well as the gender-based difference in the way the governor treated troopers. Charlotte Bennett. In a series of conversations in 2020 with an aide, Charlotte Bennett, the governor made inappropriate comments, including, among other things, 1, telling Ms. Bennett in talking about potential girlfriends for him that he would be willing to date someone who was as young as 22 years old. He knew Ms. Bennett was 25 at the time. 2, asking her whether she had been with older men. 3, saying to her during the pandemic that he was lonely and wanted to be touched. 4, asking whether Ms. Bennett was monogamous. 5, telling Ms. Bennett after she told him that she was considering getting a tattoo for her birthday, that if she decided to get a tattoo, she should get it on her butt where it could not be seen. 6, asking whether she had any piercings other than ears. And 7, saying that he wanted to ride his motorcycle into the mountains with a woman. These comments by the governor is evidence as contemporaneously in numerous text exchanges Ms. Bennett had with others, followed and coincided with discussions she previously had with the governor about her having been a survivor of sexual assault and made her extremely uncomfortable. They made her so uncomfortable that following a series of exchanges with the governor in June 2020, Ms. Bennett reported the interactions to the governor's chief of staff, while the executive chamber moved Ms. Bennett to a different position where she would not need to interact with the governor. In response to Ms. Bennett's allegations, the executive chamber did not report the allegations at the time to the governor's Office of Employee Relations, the state agency tasked with conducting harassment investigations for state agencies, and did not otherwise conduct any formal investigation. Instead, the executive chamber's senior staff sought to implement a practice whereby individual staff members who were women were not to be left alone with the governor. State entity employee number 1. In September 2019, the governor ended an event in New York sponsored by the New York State affiliated entity. Following a speech by Governor Cuomo, he posed for pictures with other attendees, including with an employee that was a state affiliated entity, who was a woman. While the picture was taken, Governor Cuomo put his hand on state entity employee's butt, tapped it twice, and then grabbed her butt. State entity employee number 1 was shocked at the time and discussed it with a number of friends, family, and coworkers. Following the advice of a friend, she also contemporaneously memorialized the governor's inappropriate touching. Virginia Limiatis. In May 2017, Virginia Limiatis attended a conservation event in upstate New York on behalf of her employer, Energy Company, at which Governor Cuomo spoke. At the event, Ms. Limiatis stood in a rope line to meet with Governor Cuomo along with other attendees. She wore a shirt that had the name of the energy company written across her chest. When Governor Cuomo reached Ms. Limiatis, he ran 2 fingers across her chest, pressing down on each of the letters as he did so, reading out the name of the energy company as he went. Cuomo then leaned in with his face close to Limiatis' cheek and said, quote, "I'm going to say I see a spider on your shoulder," before brushing his hand in the area between her shoulder and breast below her collarbone. Ms. Limiatis was shocked and immediately informed a number of other attendees of what had happened. Ms. Limiatis came forward in the investigation after she heard Governor Cuomo state during a March 3, 2021 press conference that he never touched anyone inappropriately. As Ms. Limiatis testified to us, quote, "He's lying again. He touched me inappropriately. I am compelled to come forward to tell the truth. I didn't know how to report what he did to me at the time and was burdened by shame, but not coming forward now would make me complicit in a lie, and I won't do it." Lindsey Boylan. During the period of which Lindsey Boylan served as Chief of Staff to the CEO of the Empire State Development Corporation and later as Deputy Secretary for Economic Development and Special Advisor to Governor Cuomo, Cuomo, among other things, engaged in the following harassing content on the basis of gender. 1. Commented on her appearance and attractiveness, including comparing her to a former girlfriend and describing her as attractive. 2. Paid attention to her in a way that led her supervisor to say that Governor Cuomo had a crush on her and asked her whether she needed help in dealing with Governor Cuomo's conduct. 3. Physically touched her various parts of her body, including waist, legs, and back. 4. Made inappropriate comments, including saying to her once on a plane words to the effect of, "Let's play strip poker." 5. Kissed her on the cheeks and on one occasion on the lips. Our investigation identified corroboration of Ms. Boylan's allegations, including ones Cuomo and the executive chambers denied. Following Ms. Boylan's public allegation of sexual harassment against Governor Cuomo in December 2020, at a time when she was running for public office, the governor and executive chamber actively engaged in an effort to discredit her, including by disseminating to a press confidential internal documents that painted her in a negative light and circulating among a group of current and former executive chamber employees, although not ultimately publishing a proposed op-ed or letter disparaging Ms. Boylan that Governor Cuomo personally participated in drafting. Alyssa McGrath. In his interactions with another executive assistant, Alyssa McGrath, Cuomo made inappropriate comments and engaged in harassing conduct, including 1. Regularly asking about her personal life, including her marital status and divorce. 2. Asking whether Ms. McGrath would tell on Executive Assistant 1 if she were to cheat on her husband, and whether Ms. McGrath herself planned to mingle with men on the 2 women's upcoming trip to Florida, and then calling the 2 women mingle mamas. 3. staring down her loose shirt and then commenting on her necklace, which was inside her shirt when Ms. McGrath looked up. Caitlin. Cuomo met Caitlin, whose last name has not been publicly reported, at a fundraising event on December 12, 2016. He had pictures taken with her in a dance pose, as the photographs of the event show, which made Caitlin uncomfortable. 9 days later, the executive chamber reached out to Caitlin to hire her to work for Cuomo. Caitlin was hired and approved to receive a salary of $120,000, which was so high that it was laughed at during Caitlin's interview for the position. During the year she worked at the executive chamber for Cuomo, one instructed her to act like a sponge and soak up knowledge, then proceeded to call her by the name Sponge, which she found embarrassing, condescending, and demeaning. 2. Asked about how certain members of his senior staff, known as the Mean Girls, were treating her. 3. Commented on her appearance on a number of occasions, including saying that an outfit she wore made her look like a lumberjack, and commenting on her not being ready for work, as if she were not wearing makeup or was not dressed nicely. 4. On one occasion asked her to look up car parts on eBay on his computer, which she had to bend over to do, and while wearing a skirt and heels, as the governor sat directly behind her in his office, which made her feel uncomfortable. Caitlin's colleagues at the state agency she moved to after she left the executive chamber witnessed and corroborated the impact that her experience at the executive chamber had on her, including becoming visibly distressed whenever she had to return to the executive chamber's offices for work. Anna Liss. During the time that Anna Liss worked as an aide at the executive chamber from 2013 to 2015, Cuomo, 1, addressed her almost exclusively as sweetheart or darling. 2, on occasion kissed her on the cheeks and hand, touched and held her hands, and slid his hand around her lower waist. 3, commented on how she looked lovely. 4, asked whether she had a boyfriend. Ms. Liss noted that these interactions were, in her view, inappropriate. She did not complain about or raise these incidents while employed at the executive chamber because she found, for whatever reason, in his office the rules were different. It was just, you should view it as a compliment if the governor finds you aesthetically pleasing enough, and if he finds you interesting enough to ask questions like that. And so even though it was strange and uncomfortable and technically not permissible in a typical workplace environment, I was in the mindset that it was the twilight zone and typical rules don't apply. State entity employee number 2. On March 17, 2020, then Director of New York State Department of Health, who is also a doctor, participated in a press conference with Cuomo, during which she performed a live COVID-19 nasal swab test on Cuomo. As they were preparing for the press conference outside of the presence of press, Cuomo requested that state entity employee number 2 not put the swab up his nose so deep that you hit my brain. State entity employee 2 replied that she would be gentle but accurate in conducting the swab test, to which the governor responded, "Gentle but accurate, I've heard that before." State entity number 2 felt that the governor intended to convey a joke of an implied sexual nature. Then at the press conference in front of the press and cameras, the governor stated, "Nice to see you, doctor. You make the gown look good." State entity employee number 2 found the governor's Cuomo's comments offensive and that they would not have been made to an accomplished physician who was a man. Anna Ruck. On September 14, 2019, at the wedding party of one of Cuomo's senior aides, Cuomo approached a guest, Anna Ruck, shook her hand, and then quickly moved his hand to her back, touching her bare skin where there was a cutout in her dress. Ms. Ruck felt uncomfortable and grabbed the governor's wrist and removed it from her back. At that point, the governor remarked, "Wow, you're aggressive," after which the governor cupped his hand in his hands and said, "Can I kiss you?" Without waiting for a response, and as Miss Ruck tried to move and turn her face away, the governor kissed her left cheek. Pictures taken at Miss Ruck's friends captured the governor's kiss and Miss Ruck's uncomfortable reaction. Miss Ruck immediately informed friends of what happened and how upset she was at Cuomo's physical contact. Cuomo's testimony. In his testimony, Cuomo denied inappropriately touching Executive Assistant Number 1, Trooper Number 1, State Entity Employee Number 1, or Ms. Miatas in the way they described, and he generally denied touching anyone inappropriately. The governor did state that he often hugs and kisses people, mostly on the cheek and sometimes on the forehead, while he admitted that he may have kissed certain staff members on the lips without remembering who. At least one other staff member admitted in testimony that the governor had in fact kissed her on the lips. Cuomo testified that he had not kissed Executive Number 1, Executive Assistant 1, or Ms. Boylan. With respect to Executive Assistant Number 1, Cuomo testified that he did regularly hug her, but claimed that it was Executive Assistant Number 1 who was the initiator of hugs, while he was more in the reciprocal business. He testified that he would go along with tight hugs and Executive Assistant Number 1 initiated because he did not want to make anyone feel awkward about anything. With respect to his conversations with Ms. Bennett, Cuomo testified that he had treaded very lightly because with a victim of sexual assault, and she was clearly fragile and in a delicate place. He was careful in his conversations with her. He denied saying he would be willing to date anyone over 22, saying anything related to age differences in relationships, stating that he was lonely and wanted to be touched, talking about monogamy, discussing a potential tattoo on the butt, or discussing riding into the mountains in his motorcycle with a woman. He variously describes those conversations as not having happened or having been misinterpreted by Ms. Bennett. Cuomo asserted in his testimony that Ms. Bennett, because of her experience as a sexual assault survivor, processed what she heard through her own filter, and that it was not often what was said and it was often not what was said and not what was meant. Cuomo did not dispute that he sometimes commented on staff members' appearance and attire, although generally only to compliment them, and stated that being old-fashioned, he sometimes used terms of endearment as honey, darling, or sweetheart. He also did not dispute that he gave regular hugs and kisses on the cheek and forehead, but he did dispute the way in which those actions have been interpreted by complaints. Moreover, in his testimony, Cuomo suggested that the complaints were and must be motivated by politics, animosity, or some other reason. He also expressed his view that in this investigation itself and the investigators conducting the investigation were politically motivated, an assertion that he saw in the documentary evidence of other witnesses' testimony was part of the planned response to the investigation almost as soon as it commenced. Where Cuomo made specific denials of conduct that the complaints recalled clearly, as discussed in greater detail below in the factual findings, we found his denials to lack credibility and to be consistent with the weight of the evidence obtained during the investigation. We also found that Cuomo's denials and explanations around specific allegations to be contrived. For example, he testified that Executive Assistant Number 1 was the one who initiated hugs and not him. Ms. Bennett was the one who raised the topic of potential girlfriends, not him. And he called Executive Assistant Number 1 and Ms. McGrath, quote, mingle mamas, but he never talked to them about whether they cheated on their spouses. Cuomo's blanket denials and lack of recollection as to specific incidents stood in stark contrast to the strength, specificity, and corroboration of the complainant's recollections, as well as the reports of many other individuals who offered observations and experiences with Cuomo's conduct. Impact of Governor Cuomo's conduct on the complaints. As for the impact of Cuomo's conduct on other complainants, each complainant found his conduct to be some combination of humiliating, uncomfortable, offensive, or inappropriate. Executive Assistant 1 described her response to Cuomo's intimate hugs as follows, quote, I felt that he was definitely taking advantage of me, the fact that he could tell I was nervous, he could tell I wasn't saying anything because he had gotten away with it before. Ms. Bennett summarized her reaction to one of the inappropriate conversations the governor had with her as follows, quote, I was scared and I was uncomfortable, but I was really focused on the question he was asking me because otherwise I would have been like really freaking out. In a text exchange with close friends contemporaneously with one conversation with Cuomo, Ms. Bennett texted, quote, something just happened and I can't even type it out, going to burst into tears. Yes, I'm shaking. I'm so upset and so confused. For those who work in state government, Cuomo's conduct adversely impact their work environment and the profession and personal fulfillment by each sought from their jobs. As Trooper Number One put it in describing her reaction to Cuomo running his hand across her stomach, quote, "I felt completely violated because to me, that's between my chest and my privates." She continued, "But I'm here to do a job." As Ms. Boylan described her reactions with the governor, quote, it was deeply humiliating on some level. I was really senior and I had worked my whole life to get to the point where I would be taken seriously and I wasn't being taken seriously, and I worked so hard to be some little doll of Cuomo, governor of New York, and that was deeply humiliating. The culture of the executive chamber that contributed to harassment. The complainants also described how the culture within the executive chamber, rife with fear and intimidation and accompanied by a consistent overlooking of inappropriate flirtations and other sexually suggestive and gender-based comments by Governor Cuomo, enabled the above described instances of harassment to occur and created a hostile work environment overall. As Ms. Bennett described the culture, quote, "It was extremely toxic, extremely abusive. If you got yelled at in front of everyone, it wasn't any special day. It was controlled largely by his temper, and Cuomo was surrounded by people who enabled his behavior." As a result, when Cuomo said inappropriate things, Ms. Bennett said, quote, "I was uncomfortable, but I was acutely aware that I did not want to get him mad." Executive Assistant 1 felt similarly. Quote, "I think that he definitely knew that what he was doing, and it was almost as if he would do these things and know that he would get away with it because of the fear that he knew we had." In describing the dichotomy between fear and flirtation, Ms. Boylan said, quote, "That was his light. I would say that was his if he liked you toxicity. For most people, when you're around, you saw if he hated you toxicity." Ms. McGrath summarized the impact of the culture within the executive chamber as follows. "What makes it so hard to describe every single inappropriate incident in this culture of the place? On the one hand, he makes all this inappropriate and creepy behavior normal and like you should not complain. On the other hand, you see people get punished and screamed at if you do anything where you disagree with him or his top aides. I really just wanted to go to work and be recognized for my work and nothing else." Even the state trooper of the PSU developed an understanding that they would not upset Governor Cuomo without severe consequences. As Trooper Number One noted, she knew, as many other troopers who were interviewed, of, quote, "horror stories about people getting kicked off the detail or transferred over little things that upset Governor Cuomo. As she put it, everyone knows he's very vindictive." The executive chamber's inappropriate and retaliatory response to the allegations of harassment. The evidence obtained in our investigation revealed that the complaints of fears of retaliation were justified. In response to Ms. Boylan's allegation of sexual harassment, first made in a tweet on December 13, 2020, the executive chamber engaged in a series of responsive actions that were intended to discredit and disparage Ms. Boylan. Among other things, senior staff within the executive chamber, along with a group of outside advisors, engaged in a series of retaliatory actions, including 1. Disseminating to the press previously confidential and privileged files that related to the complaints that had been made against Ms. Boylan prior to her departure from the executive chamber. 2. Preparing a proposed op-ed originally drafted by Governor Cuomo that contained personal and professional attacks on Ms. Boylan and then sharing both written drafts and the substance with a number of current and former executive chamber employees. Those involved have justified these actions as necessary to respond to what they view as misleading statements by Ms. Boylan about the reasons for her departure and an appropriate response to what they believed were improper political and retaliatory motives for her allegations. However, the confidential internal documents were released to reporters only after Ms. Boylan made allegations of sexual harassment against Governor Cuomo, and we do not find credible the claim that they were released only to rebut her statements. Ms. Boylan had made days earlier about the manner of which she departed the executive chamber. As for the draft letter attacking Ms. Boylan, although it was never actually published, in part because, as the evidence revealed, Many who reviewed it found that it constituted victim shaming that they had found inadvisable. Its substance was shared with a significant number of current and former executive chamber employees who were not otherwise aware of the information in it. As set forth in greater detail below, we conclude that the responses to Ms. Boylan's public allegations of sexual harassment against Governor Cuomo constituted unlawful retaliation, and that it was conduct that would dissuade a reasonable worker from making or supporting a charge of discrimination. Similarly, when Ms. Bennett reported interactions with Governor Cuomo that made her so uncomfortable that she said she no longer wanted to interact with him, the executive chamber's senior staff did not report it to Goer, nor did they conduct any investigation, even though both the Governor Cuomo's chief of staff at the time, Jill DeRosier, and special counsel at the time, Judy Mogul, found Ms. Bennett to be credible. Ms. DeRosier's and Ms. Mogul also found Ms. Bennett's June 2020 allegations, including that Cuomo seemed to be grooming her. Asked her if she had been with older men, asked about age differences in partners, asked her to find him a girlfriend, said that he would be fine with someone as young as 22, told her to get a tattoo on her butt where it would not be seen, said he was lonely and wanted to be touched, said he wanted to ride his motorcycle into the mountains with a woman, and called her Daisy Duke. To be sufficiently serious to implement an informal protocol to try to protect the Cuomo from being alone with young women on the executive chamber staff. Nonetheless, they decided that no report to Goer or investigation was warranted. They rationalized this decision by citing Ms. Bennett's statement that she did not want to make waves, and the view that she had acted before anything happens. But the allegations involved sexually suggestive conversations, and any claim to not see that in the governor's comments we find to not be credible. In fact, Ms. Bennett plainly had felt so uncomfortable about it that she had specifically reported it, despite all the attendant risks, and asked to be moved so that she would no longer have to interact with Cuomo. Such circumstances warranted a report to Goer and an investigation, and Ms. Bennett's desire not to make waves, driven as she was testified as to show the contemporaneous text by fear of Governor Cuomo's retaliation, is not determinative of even under the executive chamber's own policies. The New York State Employee Handbook clearly states, quote, an employee with supervisory responsibility has a duty to report any discrimination that they observe and otherwise know about. A supervisor who has received a report of workplace discrimination has a duty to report it to Goer or in accordance with the employing agency's policy, even if the individual who complained requests that it not be reported. As discussed below, we find the executive chamber failed to comply with its own internal policies in the way it handled Ms. Bennett's complaints. Assessment of governor's conduct by those familiar with the executive chamber. Although certain current and former members of the executive chamber did not take issue with the chamber's culture and express surprise at the harassment allegations that have emerged publicly, many recognize a particularly toxic and emotionally abusive environment within the executive chamber under Governor Cuomo's administration. In fact, the discussions amongst themselves after certain of the sexual harassment allegations have become public, a number of current and former senior staff members recognized the impact that the culture had in enabling the alleged harassment. One former senior staff member expressed to us the shock and dismay she felt at the abuse of individuals at the executive chamber endured, as well as deep discomfort with the example of leadership that was being set by Governor Cuomo's inner circle of advisors. In a text message between a former senior staff member and current senior staff member of the administration after Ms. Bennett's allegations became public, a former staff member noted, quote, what's crazy is if you or I did what is alleged, we'd be fired on the spot, no questions asked, and it would be the right thing to do. To which the current staff member answered, that's the damn truth. The two continued the next day after discussing Ms. Boylan's allegations, quote, the admin knows it's true. Yes, they are ready at true equals to resign. Our side have lost their way. On February 28, 2021, after Governor Cuomo's response to Ms. Bennett's allegations saying he was trying to mentor her and the former senior staff member wrote, "I believe her 100%, and his statement was gross. Trying to mentor, you creep." The same former senior staff member noted on March 2nd, 2021, quote, "Hopefully, when all this is done, people will realize the culture, even outside the sexual harassment stuff, is not something you can get away with. You can't berate and terrify people 24/7. On March 8th, 2021, another senior staff member wrote to herself the following: "I'm disgusted that Andrew Cuomo, a man who understands subtle power dynamics and power plays better than almost anyone on the planet, is giving his loopy excuse of not knowing he made women feel uncomfortable. Either he knew exactly what he was doing, likely, or he is so narcissistic that he thought all women wanted these kinds of questions. Crazy excuse even to write it. There are several orders of victims in this issue. First and foremost, the woman who experienced these things with him. Second, though, and unrecognized, are the staff. We are almost uniformly good people who kill ourselves to accomplish his agenda for his political glory and for the feeling that he would make decisions with public service as his driving goal. I feel cheated out of that." During the course of our investigation, we interviewed dozens of individuals who were comprised of complaints, current and former employees of the executive chamber, state troopers, and other state employees, and others who interacted regularly with Governor Cuomo. We have received thousands of documents, including emails, texts, and pictures. We also took sworn testimony from these complainants, as well as Governor Cuomo, his senior staff, and other key advisors, and other potentially relevant witnesses. Based on the investigation and as set forth in greater detail below, we reached the conclusion that the governor sexually harassed a number of state employees through unwelcome and unwanted touching, as well as by making numerous offensive and sexually suggestive comments. We also conclude that such behavior by the governor, Cuomo, was part of a pattern that extended to his interactions with women outside the state government and was enabled and facilitated by a culture with the executive chamber of secretary loyal to the governor and fear, as well as normalization of inappropriate comments and interactions by Governor Cuomo. Finally, we conclude that the executive chamber's response to a number of sexual harassment allegations violated its internal policies and that its response to one complainant's sexual harassment allegation constituted unlawful retaliation.